Have you ever, stumbled upon a question that just kind of sticks with you? Something about, the bigger picture, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into one of those fascinating areas, and it has to do with the future conversion of Jewish and Muslim people.
Interesting.
We've got a really interesting collection of material to go through,
Oh, cool.
including a YouTube discussion featuring Bob from Elijah's Cloak.
Okay.
And our goal today is to explore the biblical and prophetic roots of these potential large-scale shifts in faith,
Okay.
and even touch on when they might actually occur.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are very interested in that topic.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So this will be a really good deep dive.
Yeah. So for you, let's really unpack this whole thing about these future conversions.
Well, it is a question that resonates deeply, I think, across history and across different faith traditions.
Yeah.
And I think what's fascinating for you to consider right from the start is how threads of these ideas appear in very, very old texts.
Right.
And then continue to be explored in more recent prophetic visions. So it suggests a long-term perspective on the unfolding of spiritual history.
Absolutely. So let's begin with the conversion of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
The material that we're looking at points to a truly foundational passage in the Old Testament, specifically Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10.
Right.
Can you help us understand what makes this verse so significant? What's the core insight for you here?
Yeah, certainly. So Zechariah 12:10 speaks of a time when God will pour out the spirit of grace and of prayers upon the descendants of David and the people of Jerusalem.
Okay.
And crucially, it says, "They shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and shall grieve over him as the manner of grieving for the death of the firstborn."
Wow.
Now, the key understanding here for you is that within the Christian tradition extending back to the early church fathers, this passage is seen as a prophecy of the Jewish people recognizing Jesus Christ as the Messiah
Okay.
and deeply regretting their historical rejection of him.
Mm-hmm.
And the imagery of mourning for an only son really emphasizes the profound nature of this realization.
Yeah, that imagery is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it is.
Our source even brings in a quote from St. Cyril of Alexandria,
Oh, wow. Okay.
highlighting this eventual reconciliation of Israel, their return to the love of Christ through faith,
Okay.
and their astonishment at the treasure found in Christ after the conversion of the Gentiles has already taken place.
Wow.
It sounds like this wasn't just some kind of fringe belief, but something that was quite central to early Christian thought.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point for you to consider.
Yeah,
That this wasn't just some idea that was kind of, off to the side.
right.
This was front and center for the early church.
Yeah, so for you, this links these two events, like the conversion of the Gentiles and then the conversion of the Jewish people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think St. Cyril's insight really connects this to a larger unfolding of God's plan. What's important for you to note is that these aren't seen as just isolated events, but as interconnected pieces in a divine timeline. The conversion of the Gentiles in this view almost sets the stage for the subsequent turning of the Jewish people towards Christ.
Right. And then this kind of leads us to a more contemporary discussion that's raised in our material.
Okay.
And this has to do with the distinction between accompaniment and outright conversion.
Okay.
The viewpoint that's presented is quite direct, stating that for both Jewish and Muslim people, a respectful dialogue isn't the final aim,
Right.
but rather a necessary conversion.
Okay.
Based on biblical commands, the teachings of the church fathers that we just mentioned, and Jesus' own instruction to his apostles to, convert all nations.
Yeah.
This is a pretty firm stance.
Yeah.
What's the underlying reasoning for you?
I think this really hinges on core theological beliefs.
Okay.
The source really emphasizes that the fundamental difference concerning the Trinity is a primary driver for seeing conversion as necessary. Okay.
For you, the crucial point is that from this perspective, a shared belief in one God isn't sufficient.
Right.
If the understanding of God differs fundamentally, especially regarding the divinity of Christ and the Holy Trinity, these are seen as irreconcilable differences that necessitate a turning towards the Christian understanding of God.
Okay, so let's shift gears slightly.
Okay.
Beyond this kind of direct biblical basis.
Okay.
Our source delves into the prophecies of Louisa Piccarreta.
Okay.
And focuses in on her writings about a new era that includes widespread conversion.
Mm.
Her book, Book of Heaven, specifically Volume 24 from October 3, 1928, is mentioned.
Right.
What's the key insight for you from her writings regarding this future conversion?
Well, what's fascinating here for you is the symbolic exchange that she describes between Jerusalem and Rome.
Okay.
Piccarreta writes of Jerusalem giving to Rome the life of religion and therefore of redemption.
Mm.
And then Rome, in turn, will give Jerusalem the kingdom of the divine will.
Now, for your understanding, the interpretation presented is that Jerusalem, representing the Jewish people, will ultimately receive the Catholic faith. So it's a very interesting exchange back and forth.
Right, and this seems to circle right back to that passage in Zechariah.
Okay.
That idea of looking upon whom they pierced.
Right.
The source suggests a potential event that could trigger this conversion, a future warning, possibly similar to those that are mentioned in other prophecies, like from Garabandal.
Right.
This could be experienced as an internal awakening,
Yeah.
or even an external vision.
Okay.
Maybe something as impactful as St. Faustina's vision of the crucified Christ appearing in the sky.
Yeah.
It sounds like potentially like a very dramatic, game-changing moment for many.
The concept of a significant, potentially global event acting as a catalyst for widespread return to Christ
Right.
is a recurring motif in various prophetic traditions.
Right.
This warning is often described as a moment of intense personal reflection, an illumination of conscience that could profoundly influence individuals and entire groups, leading to a reassessment of their beliefs. So for you, it's about a potential moment of clarity
Right.
on a massive scale.
On like a huge scale.
Yeah.
It's interesting how the source draws a parallel between the Pharisees' initial rejection of Jesus
Yeah.
and a potential future rejection of this gift of the divine will in this new era.
Right.
It highlights that even when presented with what's seen as like a profound grace,
Right.
the possibility of choosing not to accept it still remains.
Yeah.
What does that suggest to you about the nature of faith and free will in these prophecies?
I think that's a crucial point for you to consider,
Yeah.
that these accounts consistently uphold the principle of free will,
Yeah.
even in a time of significant spiritual awakening.
Right.
The choice to embrace or reject divine grace is still seen as an individual decision.
Right.
So this underscores the idea that conversion isn't a forced event,
Right.
but a response to a perceived truth.
Okay, so now let's focus in on St. Paul's writings.
Okay.
Specifically, Romans chapter 11, verses 1 through 15.
Right.
This passage appears to be like really central
Yeah.
to this discussion about the conversion of Israel.
Yeah, definitely.
What are the core ideas that Paul lays out here for us?
So Romans 11 delves into what appears to be a paradoxical situation.
Okay.
The Jewish people's initial rejection of Christ ultimately leading to the salvation of the Gentiles. Paul suggests that their loss actually became the means for the reconciliation of the world,
Right.
and their eventual receiving will be like life from the dead.
Okay.
Now, for you, it's important to understand that this life from the dead isn't just about individual conversions,
Right.
but it's often interpreted as a spiritual revival of the Jewish people as a whole. So a resurrection of the people, so to speak.
That phrase, life from the dead, really paints a vivid picture.
It does.
Our source connects us back to the Old Testament,
Okay.
specifically Elijah's experience in 1 Kings, where he felt that he was the only faithful prophet left.
Right.
This is presented as a kind of echo of the Jews' initial rejection and their prophesied future widespread return to faith.
Yeah.
So for you, this historical parallel really emphasizes this theme of perseverance and eventual restoration.
And the parallel with Elijah is quite insightful for your understanding.
Right.
Because it underscores the idea that even during times when faith seems to be dwindling
Yeah.
or loss,
Yeah.
a faithful remnant can remain, and there's always that potential for dramatic turning back to God.
Right. The source then goes deeper into Romans 11, actually sharing some of the verses directly,
Okay.
which is really helpful to hear, in their own words.
Yeah.
Paul talks about salvation coming to the Gentiles in order to make Israel envious.
Yeah.
The greater riches that their full inclusion will bring.
Right.
And that powerful image of the Gentiles is like a wild olive shoot being grafted into the natural branches of Israel. He also addresses how some branches were broken off due to unbelief, but stresses God's ability to graft them back in if they don't persist in their unbelief.
Right.
And then, of course, we have that really powerful statement, all Israel will be saved.
Right.
For you, what's the weight of all these different images and ideas?
Well, for you, I think the key is to see how Paul weaves together these metaphors to explain a complex situation.
Okay.
So the wild olive shoot imagery highlights how Gentiles, who are not originally part of the covenant with God,
Right.
have been brought into that covenant through Christ.
Okay.
The branches broken off speaks to the temporary rejection of Jesus by some within Israel.
Hmm.
But the crucial element is this promise that God has the power and the intention to graft them back in.
Right.
And that statement, all Israel will be saved, while debated in its exact meaning,
Right.
is generally understood as a promise of a future large-scale turning of the Jewish people to Christ.
Okay.
So there's a lot packed into those verses.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul himself acknowledges this as like a mystery. This hardening in part that has come upon Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Our source connects this idea to the current apostasy in the West,
Okay.
suggesting that perhaps this period of widespread decline in faith might signal that the time of the Gentiles is drawing to a close,
Yeah.
potentially indicating a new era for Israel's regrafting.
Interesting.
What do you make of that connection for you?
What's a thought-provoking connection for you to consider?
Right.
The idea that a decline in faith within traditionally Christian nations
Right.
could coincide with a renewed focus on Israel's salvation aligns with certain interpretations of end times prophecy.
Right.
It suggests a possible shift in the central focus of God's salvific work in the world.
So when we talk about the timing and potential triggers for this, our source emphasizes that the current apostasy, this weakening of faith in many places, could actually serve to highlight God's hand more clearly in any future conversion and renewal. It also makes an important point for you. Not all Jewish people rejected Jesus.
Of course.
The apostles themselves were Jewish.
Right.
So this prophecy speaks to the conversion of those who haven't yet embraced the Christian faith.
Yeah.
That's a crucial nuance, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's vital for you to understand that this isn't about a first-time encounter with God for the Jewish people, but rather a large-scale turning towards the specific Christian understanding of the Messiah by those who haven't yet accepted it.
Right. The discussion then touches on these different interpretations of the Third Temple prophecy among some Jews and Protestants. And the idea that the warning that we mentioned earlier could be seen by some in that context as a form of the coming of Jesus. Perhaps not the final coming, but an intermediate one. Possibly linked to the sixth seal in the book of Revelation. But the underlying message, our source points out, is that evangelism, sharing the Christian faith, remains a call for everyone, including those already within the church who might have drifted during this current period of weakening faith.
It's a universal call to engagement.
Right. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the conversion of Muslims in other nations. Our source, again, refers to Louisa Piccarreta's Prophecies, highlighting this promise of widespread conversion in this new era, and connecting it to the imagery in the book of Revelation of 1,000 years of peace, which is also described as the triumph of the Immaculate Heart and the establishment of the kingdom of the divine will. What are the key aspects of this for you?
Well, for you, the 1,000 years of peace symbolizes a significant period of spiritual flourishing and the widespread influence of Christ's reign on earth. Descriptions like the triumph of the Immaculate Heart and the kingdom of the divine will point to different dimensions of this anticipated era of profound peace and holiness, suggesting a time of great spiritual unity and alignment with God's will.
Our source mentions other related prophecies of holy popes and bishops leading the church, a return of Catholics to a more fervent faith, a unification with the Orthodox Church, and the conversion of nations that have historically not been Catholic. It then revisits Louisa Piccarreta's prophecy about that exchange between Jerusalem and Rome, emphasizing the deeper meaning, the gift of redemption originating from Jerusalem, and the gift of the divine will then flowing from Rome back to Jerusalem. It paints kind of a beautiful picture for you of a reciprocal spiritual exchange and a coming together.
And I think this idea of Rome as the center of the Catholic Church, bestowing the gift of the divine will upon Jerusalem, which in this context represents the full conversion of the Jewish people to the Catholic faith, really underscores this vision of ultimate unity envisioned in these prophecies. So for you, it highlights a future where those historical divisions are overcome.
The material also touches on the idea that the Jewish people who convert during this time will experience a deep sorrow for having previously turned away from Christ. It adds an emotional layer to this future event for you to consider.
And I think That element of sorrow and repentance really emphasizes the deeply personal nature of this conversion.
Yeah.
It's not just an intellectual acceptance of like a new set of beliefs,
Right.
but a profound emotional and spiritual reckoning with the past
Right.
and an embrace of a new future in faith.
So this naturally brings us to the question of future popes.
Okay.
In light of well-known prophecies, like those that are attributed to Garibald el-Fatima and St. Malachy,
Yeah.
our source explains one interpretation,
Okay.
which suggests that Peter the Roman, who is considered to be the 112th pope in St. Malachy's list,
Right.
might be the last pope of the current era, with future popes leading a church that has undergone significant purification.
Okay.
The current widespread decline in faith is seen as a form of chastisement and purification, potentially leading to like a significant transformation of the institution as we know it, eventually emerging in a purer, holier form.
Hmm.
What are the key implications of this for you?
Well, for you, this interpretation suggests a period of significant upheaval and change within the church,
Yeah.
but with the ultimate goal of renewal and purification.
Right.
And I think Pope Benedict VI's own statements about a future, smaller, more humble church
Right.
really resonate with this idea of institutional transformation.
Yeah.
So it's a picture of stripping away what is not essential
Hmm.
to reveal a stronger spiritual core.
The concept of a future holy pontiff in prophecy is also discussed.
Yeah.
Someone who is likely to proclaim significant Marian dogmas and promote more traditional Catholic practices.
Right.
Our source even quotes Louisa Piccarreta, volume 27,
Okay.
who speaks of a future Roman pontiff whose duty it will be to make known the kingdom of the divine will, just as the mystery of redemption was once proclaimed.
Hmm.
This really points to like a pivotal role for a future pope in this new era for you.
Yeah, this highlights this idea of continuity within the papacy,
Right.
even through periods of great difficulty.
Right.
And the figure of a holy pontiff often symbolizes a leader who guides the church towards a deeper understanding
Right.
and living out of its core teachings,
Hmm.
potentially ushering in a new spiritual emphasis, as suggested by Piccarreta's writings.
The worsening of trials and tribulations leading up to that warning event is also mentioned,
Right.
based on a statement that's attributed to Mary Lawley.
Okay.
And our source provides some stark examples of what it sees as current signs of this decline in faith.
Okay.
Things like a soccer banner in Spain with controversial imagery,
Right.
issues surrounding religious expression at the Olympics,
Yeah.
and the removal of a large cross in Spain.
Right.
These are presented as like tangible examples for you to consider in light of these prophecies.
Yeah, and these examples, whether one agrees with their interpretation or not,
Right.
serve as illustrations of the ongoing tensions and challenges surrounding faith and its public expression
Right.
in the modern world.
In the modern world, yeah.
So for you, they underscore the sense of a shifting cultural landscape in relation to religious belief.
But amidst this rather sobering picture of decline, there's a strong element of hope.
Right.
The potential devoutness of converted Jewish people is highlighted as an example of the kind of profound faith that could emerge from future conversions. The wild olive tree analogy from Romans is brought up again,
Okay.
emphasizing this idea that the Jewish people have a natural connection to the roots of the faith.
Yeah.
Our source also shares a quote from Louisa Piccarreta, volume 12,
Okay.
describing the state of the world before this major purging,
Right.
with nations acting like the Tower of Babel, unable to understand each other,
Right.
marked by revolts, rejection of leadership, humiliation, and a false sense of peace. It's a description that might resonate with some of the challenges that we see today. What do you take away from this juxtaposition of decline and hope for you?
Well, for you, this contrast emphasizes that even in times of great difficulty and division,
Right.
there's a persistent hope for renewal and restoration.
Right.
The image of the converted Jewish people as examples of deep faith and that wild olive tree analogy
Yeah.
both point to the potential for a vibrant resurgence of faith from unexpected places.
Right. Okay, so this current period of purification is presented as potentially preparing a clean slate
Okay.
for like significant outpouring of grace through these prophesied events
Right.
and the eventual establishment of the kingdom of the divine will.
Right.
The fact that Louisa's writings were taken from archives relatively recently, around 30 years ago,
Yeah.
and St. Pio's reported prophecy about her light shining brightly in the new millennium are highlighted, suggesting their relevance for our current times. St. Pio's encouragement of the spiritual practice of the hours of the Passion is also mentioned as something that's particularly relevant during the season of Lent.
Right.
So for you, these aren't just abstract ideas from the distant past, but potentially very pertinent for today.
That's a crucial point for you to grasp.
Yeah.
The closeness in time of these prophetic voices
Right.
and their endorsements by respected figures like St. Pio lend a sense of immediacy and relevance to their messages, suggesting they might hold particular significance for the challenges and opportunities of our current era.
So to bring it all together for you in this deep dive, we've explored the biblical foundations and prophetic perspectives on the future large-scale conversion of Jewish and Muslim people. We've looked at the potential role of this significant warning event and considered how the current period of apostasy might be understood as a form of purification, leading to this renewed era of faith and greater unity. It's clear that these prophecies offer like a long-term view that stretches far beyond our immediate circumstances.
Precisely. These aren't predictions of isolated short-term events, but rather a grander vision of God's ongoing interaction with humanity. A long arc that includes periods of difficulty and ultimately points towards a future of greater spiritual harmony and understanding.
This leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. Consider how your understanding of these prophecies, regardless of whether you interpret them literally or more symbolically, might influence how you view current global and religious trends. And perhaps more importantly, think about what role you as an individual might have to play in whatever way feels meaningful to you during this time of potential purification or the coming new era that these sources describe.
It's really a call to action for the listener.
We encourage you to continue reflecting on these ideas and to explore these sources further on your own.